Welcome, everybody. I'm Jan Lodel. I'm a distinguished fellow here and former president, and was asked to give a few introductory remarks and also brag a little bit about this book, which the Council and many other organizations, primarily NATO, put together. And I'm not sure. I think it's just hot off the presses, and unfortunately, I don't think we have copies for everybody right here. There's also a PDF version that you can download. It will be the basis for our discussion today, but we won't be limited to it. But it's really a terrific book and goes through the cyber question in the context of Ukraine and what happened in Ukraine very thoroughly. I'd like to start with a little bit of an anecdote, which I always come back to because it keeps making me think about where we stand with regard to cyber warfare. 18 years ago, Anita Jones was confirmed as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, which is the job that, among other things, oversees DARPA and all these important high-tech kinds of activities inside the Defense Department, and was responsible for the growing field of cybersecurity. It was right at that time that the World Wide Web was really coming into use, and Netscape was our main browser, and it was all very new. As it turns out, I was confirmed by the Senate the same day that Anita was for the job of Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, and I had known Bill Perry, the Secretary, in a software company that we were both involved with starting up. So he knew that I knew something about software, and he knew that Anita, who had been a distinguished professor of computer sciences at UVA, later became a university professor at UVA, was one of the nation's real experts on this subject, as well as her husband, who was the head of the National Academies of Engineering. So he asked us to kind of take over informally the question of cybersecurity, cyber warfare, and those kinds of things. And it turned out that Anita and I, and in fact Secretary Perry, fairly quickly came to the conclusion that the United States would be better off in a world in which cyber attacks weren't really possible, at least not against serious systems that were military in nature, systems that ran critical infrastructure and so forth, and that we would be better off in that world even if it meant that we couldn't attack the other side's systems and get inside them also. And we believed that it was feasible for the Department of Defense to motivate the creation of such a world, really without any particular regulations, except for how people interacted with those of us that were in the Department of Defense. And in the interim, we managed to get some things changed. We managed to make sure that classified systems were completely separate from unclassified systems. People said, oh, well, we can deal it with software and so, that sort of thing. We did an unannounced exercise and in one day found 118 undocumented and very dangerous connections between our classified system and our unclassified systems. So finally, we got that across and so forth. But we faced a huge mountain of resistance inside the U.S. government to trying to do what we thought needed to be done. And the mountain of resistance was from two sources: the intelligence community, really three sources: the intelligence community, the law enforcement community, and people who were concerned about privacy and freedom of the internet. I think we weren't able to make the case that what we were saying was that you really couldn't be on the internet as we knew it if you wanted to be secure. You couldn't be on the World Wide Web. But in any case, that was 18 years ago. Now, does that sound like the argument we're having today? Yes, absolutely. That's the argument the FBI has been having with regard to its cell phones with Apple today. That's the argument that NSA has been having ever since, and that we had in those days. And some of the same people have followed through year after year. So I go through this anecdote to make the point that this issue remains a very big issue for us, and it's a policy issue in the largest sense and in the most important sense. Not everybody agrees with Anita and me and a lot of others who feel that as long as we try to run all of our systems on one consistent World Wide Web with one consistent TCP/IP underlying structure for all the packets inside it, and essentially only one approach for public key cryptography and one approach for encryption and when you use it and when you don't, that we'll have these problems. Now, some sections of our economy try to get out of all that. The banks try to get out of it. Some others try to get out of it. We try to get our public infrastructure off the World Wide Web. And a lot of military stuff is, in fact, completely separated and off it. But in any event, that comes to our issue of Ukraine and this particular war. This is probably the best real-world example we have of what life is like in the cyber world that we face today, that we have today, that is the reality today. And it has many, many dimensions. It has the dimensions of information warfare. How can you use our cyber environment today to, in effect, propagate your lies, to control the thoughts of those that you're trying to attack or take over? Most of you aren't old enough to remember the 1984 novel and Big Brother and the computer screen in everybody's room, which was supposed to be utterly fanciful. This could never really happen, of course, was piping information into your brain and therefore controlling your brain. And as we were joking ahead of the talk today, it turns out that it really didn't happen. The computer screen isn't up there piping information. The thing that pipes information is now actually in everybody's pocket, and they're carrying it around, and it's being piped right there when they read their Facebooks and their Twitters and their emails and all the other things that are showing up on their screen. And if somebody controls that and puts it out there, and you can't tell the difference between what's wrong, what's right and what's wrong, what's true and what's false, it can have a very powerful impact. And that happened to a significant degree. Fortunately, not a determinative degree in this conflict, continues to happen in this conflict with Russia in Ukraine, where Russia has mounted a major effort to push its propaganda through the cyber system of Ukraine. In a strange way, because Ukraine's a bit backwards on this, it didn't hurt them as much as it might have if they were more modern and more people were on the web all the time, looking at their screens all the time. And the same thing is true with regard, of course, to the Ukrainian military. There were many attempts to attack them, some successful, but it wasn't so much that kind of a war because Ukraine had to fight it with a lot of very old-fashioned weapons. And in many cases, they didn't have any communications with anybody, so cyber attacks didn't even have a way to get to their systems. But that wasn't always the case. There were situations. There were even some crude drones that were brought down by Russian cyber capabilities. So all elements of this problem were illuminated in this war and brought to the fore. And this study by NATO, in which in which several Atlantic Council people and others in the room participated, I think is the first comprehensive effort to try to see what are the lessons learned from here and how do we go forward and try to keep this from happening in a situation where it would have significantly more impact. So with these introductory remarks, I'd like to turn things over to our panel, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and I think you have the sheet that has their, maybe it doesn't have their brief bios on here, but Bo Woods will moderate the discussion. He's the Deputy Director of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative here in the Brent Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council. And Dr. Kenneth Geers will speak first, and Kenneth is the editor of this book and really pulled it together and splits his time between here and Ukraine. So he has a hands-on expertise with regard to what's happening in Ukraine. Jeffrey Mankoff is here with us from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's from the Russian Eurasia program and has looked carefully at the political aspects of the war and how it interacts with cybersecurity. And Alina Polyakova is the deputy director of the Dina Patriciou Eurasia Center, which is the center that looks after our Ukraine projects here. I don't believe that Martin is here. Oh, no, Martin's here. Yeah, hello, Martin. Welcome. I had the pleasure of participating with Martin in a cybersecurity project at the National Academies about 5-6 years ago, I think it was, where he wrote a brilliant paper for that also, and he did the same here. So, without further ado, I welcome our panel.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Ken, I'll turn it over to you to do a brief introduction of the book and kind of frame the conversation for us today, and then we'll have a moderated panel discussion. In the last half hour or so, we'll open it up to questions and answers.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. So I talked to NATO Cyber Center in Estonia about a book, doing a book while I'm in Kiev for a couple of years. And basically, it's a topic that I really enjoy, which is kind of what is the cyber dimension of something, particularly international relations or a conflict. So in Ukraine, it appears that there's all the ingredients for cyber war. You have hackers, strong background in education of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. There's a hot war ongoing, and so why not? Let's see where we are in the history of warfare in terms of IT and abuse of IT. So in that sense, it would be a benchmark. So I asked 20 authors, basically, to contribute, and I got an overwhelmingly positive response. The book is divided basically into 5 sections: strategy, tactics, information warfare, policy law, and future. So in the beginning of the book, we have Keir Giles from Chatham House, Jim Wirtz, who's the dean of the Naval Postgraduate School, Jim Lewis, and Martin Libicki. And Keir looks at basically the local landscape and the conflict on the ground, since he follows that on a daily basis. Jim Wirtz looked at the global perspective in terms of integration of cyber strategies and tactics into national programs. And one of the things that he mentions is this should help with attribution because of the bureaucratic nature of the APTs or the nation states in cyberspace, the need they have to basically bureaucratize cyber warfare should yield some level of cyber attribution, because cyber attacks you should be able to associate with somebody's national security requirements. Jim Lewis looks at metrics and says basically you need something real, something tangible, either in a strategic or a tactical sense. Otherwise, what's the point of a cyber attack? So he looks at metrics. I'll let Martin speak for his own chapter. Next, we have a tactical level. So the book wouldn't really be anything without actual cyber attacks having taken place. Otherwise, there would be nothing to analyze. So we have the head of the Ukrainian CERT. Basically, and in his chapter, he describes that cyber attacks basically rose in parallel with political events on the ground. The more serious things got, the more serious did the cyber attacks become. And when the shooting started, then you saw the most serious attacks take place. Another leader in sort of Ukrainian cybersecurity, Gleb Pakharenko, he looks basically at individual attacks, both in Maidan, in Crimea, and in Donbass today, basically. And what you can see is almost every significant political event had some cyber attacks associated with it. And when you put them all together, one of the things that you see is that Ukraine is different from Estonia and different from Georgia and elsewhere, really today, because social media, for example, is so powerful in everyone's life. You can see basically in the diplomatic, political sphere, economic, and military, there's examples of attacks, of use of IT and the abuse of IT. Jen Whedon, she's now at Facebook. She was at FireEye previously. She looked at, this is what I did when I was at FireEye, look at infrastructure, basically data from around the world, and try and find existing cyber warfare infrastructure. So what she looked at was that which might be Russian infrastructure that could support cyber operations. Tim Maurer, he looks at the use of proxies. And one of the things that he found is that still today, it looks like cyber criminals in the region have not been swayed by geopolitics. They're still primarily on the side of making money. So the conflict hasn't got hot enough. Some of the hacker types that I know in Ukraine, they say that's not quite true. One of the things you can see is all of the hacker forums, basically, whereas you didn't know who was Ukrainian and who was Russian before the conflict got more serious, all of a sudden they started taking sides, and you could in fact see it. But I think Tim is right, and there hasn't been the kind of patriotic hacker activity that we've seen, for instance, in Estonia. The section on information warfare, we have Margareta Yatner. She's from the Swedish Defense College, basically describing Russian military doctrine and a belief in Moscow that information control works. And so the party that controls information is the party that should win a conflict. We have the two centers of excellence, both in Tallinn and in Latvia, that are within NATO, looking at strategic communications and describing it as a fertile ground, but one that has not particularly described cyber, either via Putin or Poroshenko, as particularly important in this conflict. And then they also describe the importance of narrative in terms of a resilient, soft power, non-propaganda type education and awareness on the part of the population in order to understand when you see propaganda and to react with common sense and wisdom. In the policy and law section, we have Nadia Kostyuk. She's doing her PhD at Michigan under Bob Axelrod. She's looking at the development of Ukrainian cybersecurity policy. And I can say that primarily she's pessimistic currently that this will be quick or easy given the political and military crises in the country. We have the Center of Excellence in Estonia, basically from a legal perspective, describing what NATO lawyers, how they're informing the Tallinn manual process on international law as it relates to cyber warfare. Basically, one of the fundamental things that the lawyers are saying, if nobody dies, nobody cares, right? So cyber warfare still seems to be flying under the radar of what is serious today. And that's a real problem given that, over time, for example, Chinese espionage against U.S. nuclear infrastructure, you could say that eventually will have a strategic impact, or against the J-35 in terms of airplanes, for example. So another chapter from the NATO Center of Excellence looks at international norms. And a couple of things, one good and one bad. So there haven't been, and I'll describe one in a second, but attacks on critical infrastructure that have been serious. And that may be good, especially if it's intentional restraint on the behalf of nation states not to go after each other's financial system or electricity supply. That would be good in terms of development of international norms. On the bad side, Russia and this Shanghai Cooperation Organization basically are pushing for protection of information space. So you may or may not be aware of this, but there's a little, international cybersecurity conferences, there's a little bit of an ongoing debate over cybersecurity versus information security. On the Western side, the discussion is more about how to protect systems and protocols from technical attacks, whereas over coffee at the breaks, the discussion goes like this. The Russians are more concerned about information security, and they do describe it as such. In other words, a blog, an anti-Putin blog, would be a cyber attack, right? And that's fundamentally different, perhaps two different definitions. Moscow and Beijing and Iran, for example, they don't have to follow what the Pentagon characterizes as a cyber attack. They can come up with their own definitions. We have Jarno Limnell. He's a professor in Finland, a military professor, describing the impact of the conflict in Ukraine and its cyber component on the other nations in the region, and what they're doing to reinforce their defenses and how they're encouraging NATO to build a cyber framework of defense. And then finally, we have two chapters at the end in the future section. One is Jason Healy and Michel Cantos, and they look at 4 scenarios for the future. How could this play out? One of them, I'll just give you 2 of them. One of them is that even if things cool down on the battlefield, traditional battlefield, you can still increase the temperature in cyberspace. So it gives you another way to go, another tool in the toolbox. Final scenario is what if Putin was really pushed against the wall, right? The regime where it's in its final throes. Would Russia have the capability to bring down the internet entirely, right? So that's a technical question and also a philosophical question for us. And then finally, the very last chapter in the book is Richard Baitlick from Brookings talks about, and I like this, a strategic problem like nation-state cyber attacks against you requires a strategic solution. So APT attacks, or the advanced persistent threat, it's not just a one-time thing, right? You can't buy software for this, or you can't do a configuration and solve the problem. It's going to be a long-term process over time that requires serious investment in education all the way up. And in Estonia, for example, all school children now are coding from a young age, right? So Estonia, they really sort of aspire to be that for the world. So that's basically a quick description of the book and the parts that are in it. You can download the chapters from the NATO Cyber Center website individually or the whole book together. But thank you very much for being here, and I'll pass it back to Bo.
Good, thanks. One of the observations that I've kind of made in looking around at a lot of this, the things around the Ukraine crisis, seems like there is a really big deal there. Of course, I care a lot about it because we've seen the use of a lot of cyber power, nation-state level or potentially non-nation-state levels exerting their force in the Ukrainian theater. But I wonder, Alina and Jeff, if you have any thoughts about what makes this crisis in Ukraine different from other crises around the world. Is it just the cyber component, the heavy dependence on cyber attacks, or are there other really interesting things that maybe play into the motivations for using cyber as a tool of enforcing this power?
It's a great question, and thanks so much, Kenneth, for the overview of the book. I know that wasn't an easy task given the many components to it. I think we're talking about Ukraine, just kind of taking a broader perspective, and to also speak to your question about what makes this particular crisis unique. You have to go back to what happened a little over 2 years ago, which is, of course, the Maidan Revolution. And what was unique about the Maidan Revolution for Ukrainians was that if we compare that with the previous revolution, which was the Orange Revolution, this one was particularly savvy and driven by the social media, as Kenneth was mentioning. In fact, the protests were started as, I believe, a tweet or a Facebook post by a journalist, and from that became what it was, which was a social movement that eventually included almost 1 million people. So I think when we think about social movements more broadly, not just in Ukraine, we've really seen a transformation over the last 6 years about how social movements form, how democratic protests take shape, and what they're able to accomplish with the use of these new technologies. Now, of course, having this dependence on social media specifically also opens these social movements and these individuals to certain vulnerabilities in the cyber and the information space. And we've particularly seen in Ukraine Another, I think, unique aspect of the ongoing crisis has been how Russia has been very good at using those vulnerabilities to its advantage, and not just in the information space, which we tend to think as sort of observers of this situation more happening to the propaganda, television, print, online, but in actually producing a mass amount of information to crowd the information space and to attack individuals on their personal Facebook or Kontakte, which is the Russian version of Facebook, accounts, and on their Twitter. So now we have a situation where individuals are seeking more and more encrypted sources of communication when they're communicating amongst themselves, which used to not be the case. And that's been an interesting thing to observe, how from the Russian perspective, setting up these troll factories, as some of us have read about, to crowd out information, not to produce a certain narrative, but to disinform and to crowd the space and to attack the opinions of these activists, journalists, et cetera.
Good.
Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add to that is I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is a Russian approach to conflict that you see in discussions in Washington a lot, the term hybrid warfare. And I think that's a term that can be stretched and manipulated to mean about 65 different things. So I'm not going to use it, but I do think what you've seen displayed in Ukraine is the employment of a wide range of conventional and unconventional tools for achieving political ends. And Alina laid out how that's being done in the cyber domain. But I think about it as being a kind of integrated approach to national power, where things like control of the information space, shaping of narratives through traditional media, particularly television, as well as the uses of provocateurs, financial support, control of the media, control of financial flows, are all used and are coordinated and integrated in a way to achieve a desired political end. Obviously, for Russia, Ukraine is in some ways an ideal case for using these tools because you have a largely Russian-speaking environment. You have a large number of people who identify with or as Russian, even though not as many as the Kremlin apparently thought it was going to find. But you do have much more of a common sort of information space. You're seeing Russia try similar tactics in other contexts, certainly in Europe. Even in the United States, though, I haven't seen them recently, but a year or so ago, if you walked around central Washington, you saw these billboards for RT. And there was one that had a cartoon of Colin Powell holding up something that looked like, maybe it was a vial with something in it. And it said, no WMDs in Iraq, 500,000 people dead. This is what happens if you don't have alternative sources of information. And so that's the role that Russia's kind of putting itself out there to support, trying to undermine the coherence of the narrative that we tell ourselves about what's going on in the world. I've heard a number of people on panels like this say, if you look at RT, which is the Russian media conglomerate, it's important to keep in mind what their motto is, right? It's not go Russia or Russia is great. It's question more. So the idea that you can sow doubt. It's a kind of postmodern approach to information and to diplomacy. And we've seen it play out in different contexts. Ukraine so far has been kind of the apogee, but to the extent that we're in a period of heightened geopolitical tension with Russia, we're fighting in various ways a competition for influence in Europe and in the former Soviet Union and elsewhere. There are lessons in terms of what Russia was able to do, those capabilities that it demonstrated in Ukraine that are applicable in some of these other contexts as well, that I think the United States, its allies, other countries should at least be cognizant of and think about how to cope with.
Yeah, I want to pull the thread on one of the things you said. It's kind of interesting to me because I think I've heard two disparate opinions, so I want to pull it apart and see if there's some conclusion. You mentioned that RT was running billboards sowing doubt about war in Iraq or essentially the public discussion in the U.S. And then what I heard from one of the summaries of the book chapters is that a blog post attacking Putin's reputation might be considered a cyber attack. So then, given those two statements, would the billboards essentially be a physical attack in the Russian information warfare sense?
Yeah, that's right. So this was pointed out in the book, in that if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, there is a lot of propaganda, right? But that's precisely what I think Moscow is terrified about coming its way. So that does it leaves, I would think, the Russian negotiators in a tricky position, or in need of another bottle, right? Because it's tough, right? Clearly, they believe in pushing their side of the story heavily, but that's precisely what, via the UN, they're trying to prevent coming back their way.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that the contexts are different, right? We have open societies, liberal societies. We have the First Amendment that guarantees freedom of speech. And I think Russia understands that. They try and take advantage of it. In Russia itself, there's a much different approach to information security. And under those rules and regulations, it's harder to pull the same trick. And I know there's been some debate in Washington and within the US government about how do you counter Russian propaganda? Well, do you put out your own counter propaganda? And I don't think this is a good idea. I think most of the people who actually sit down and try and think through the problem come to the conclusion that it's not a good idea. I mean, one, because we're not very good at it. But two, because what the whole point of our approach to this information is to get the truth out there, right? It's to be fact-based. It's to be as objective as possible, and that's what you see from even government-funded news outlets like Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And if you start going down the path of trying to counteract Russian propaganda with your own propaganda, then you kind of lose the moral high ground, and there is that moral equivalence that I think is the basis of what RT and other Russian outlets are trying to do.
Yeah, just to add very quickly to pick up on a thread that Jeff just laid out about how Russia is able to use the very values that we hold dear in democracy, is about freedom of expression and plurality of opinion, to its own advantage, to crowd out the information space. And just to add a little bit on top of that, what's been interesting to also observe is because we now live in the world of instant information flows, how Russian media, which is state-controlled, and to add to this, that the media environment in Russia has been over the last, I would say, probably since 2000 at this point, since President Putin has come to power, has become increasingly more controlled by the state. At this point, there are very few independent media outlets in Russia. There's been a very serious clampdown on sort of voices of opposition, and this is extended to the online space as well. So many organizations and companies can't function in Russia, for example. They're pushed out, especially if they receive any sort of foreign funding. They can be easily declared as a foreign agent, according to Russian federal code, and basically be shut down, in effect, de facto shut down. So I think that's also important to remember, that the media space that Russia has is very different from our media space. And what is interesting is these feedback loops that happen. So when we have a Western commentator put out an opinion piece, for example, this happened just recently with a particular piece I'm thinking of, being critical of the West, for example. This is part of our culture, the plurality of opinion. This gets instantly picked up by the Russian media and then presented as, look, there's a prominent Western expert who is putting out the exact same narrative that we have been putting out, the degradation of the West and sort of the coup in Ukraine, for example, not being a democratic revolution. And so our opinions are also used within Russia itself, so for domestic purposes and reasons. And I think this is a very complicated issue, because then it puts into focus how much do we question the kind of opinions and the information that we put out there to uphold our democratic ideals, but at the same time, we also have to be aware that that feeds a certain political agenda in places like Russia.
So we all kind of recognize that there's lots of cyber capability within Russia, both the government apparatus as well as the private citizens and some of the sub-state actors there. And if they've been turned into this kind of troll factory to go and manufacture disinformation or a contrary narrative. I wonder why we haven't seen as much more kinetic action. We've seen some, what we think are at least state-sponsored attacks against civilian infrastructure, but maybe this use of force is actually quite restrained in comparison to what it could be. And Martin, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a very good question. If you'd have asked people 20 years ago, imagine something like the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, they would, to a man or woman, say, yeah, there will be cyber. We'll definitely see cyber, okay? We had spent 20 years and had not seen much cyber in the context of conflict, either because one side didn't have the right targets, or the other side didn't have the right attackers, or sometimes both. Well, you can't make that excuse here, right? Because Ukraine is at least a quasi-developed country, Russia is at least a quasi-developed country, Russia has a rapidly modernizing military. Both of these countries have deep reservoirs of hackers, and yet we're not seeing it, okay? Now, what do I mean by we're not seeing it? Because there are a lot of people who go around saying, oh yeah, there's tons of cyber conflict. The word cyber is a very, very plastic word. So what I want to try to basically say is, look, this is what we've seen. We've seen espionage. We've seen lots of cyber espionage, primarily by Russians, but not only by Russians. We've seen distributed denial of service attacks, okay, relatively less important in this conflict than they were in Estonia and Georgia, but they've been there. We've seen a lot of electronic warfare. We've seen people attack telephone systems by occupying switches, and we've seen the use of wire cutters, okay? We've seen a lot of traditional stuff. But until Christmas, there was no attempt to carry out a cyber attack against any piece of the critical infrastructure, and we have no information at this point that there's been a cyber attack against military systems. Now, that may come out later, or it may not. Okay, well, right now we're dealing with absence of evidence. That's not necessarily proof of absence, but with every passing year, it looks more likely. Okay, so the question in my mind, or anybody's mind looking at this, is why haven't we seen this? Why has this dog not barked? And I think there's sort of three explanations we want to go down. The first explanation is that Russia has other ways of influencing Ukrainians' infrastructure. Russia owns a large percentage of the telephone system. They've designed a large percentage of it. A lot of Ukrainians use Russian social media, for which Russians have a great deal of interception control. If the Russians wanted to reduce the electricity supplies going to Ukraine, there's a lot of easy ways of doing it because, in fact, the two are connected on a very similar grid. So there's a trade-off in cyber war. I can intercept information on a system. I can attack information on a system. If I intercept information on a system, I can be there for a long amount of time because you may not know anything that's going on is particularly different. Once I attack it and you see visible effects, then my time on that system may be short-lived because I prompted you as a defender to say, hold on, something isn't going right. Let's turn the system over to figure out what's going on. So there may have been a deliberate choice to go for cyber espionage and not go to cyber attack at all, okay? The two factors I would focus on, one is that in certain ways, both Ukraine and Russia are pretending there's no war going on, that it's a local conflict. And for Ukraine to attack Russia would change the nature of the conflict, and Russia to attack Ukraine in force would make it very difficult to make the argument that it's a civil war because the rebels in the Donbass area just don't have enough hackers to be credible, right? If there's a lot of hacking, it's coming in from the Russian state. Then there's a last possibility, which I throw up in the air, and that is we may have overestimated a lot of what cyber war can do. That a lot of cyber war gives you a sort of a one-off capability that has temporary effects in it. And trying to find something that's cost-effective for a military to do in cyberspace that has real military effects may be a lot harder than the community has assumed. But as they say, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, and it's still high noon in Ukraine.
Yeah, and one of the things that some observers have commented on is the fact that the attack on the Ukrainian energy grid lasted less than 6 hours.
Right.
Meanwhile, there was a physical attack on the transmission lines from Ukraine southward that essentially took out power for days and weeks. I don't know if they're
Long
still
time.
back on yet, right? So are the capabilities of cyber attack truly what we think they are? You know, could you blow up substations practically? Was potentially the cyber attack, was that a limited attack for some strategic purpose? Was it too rushed?
I'm glad you brought up that
thoughts?
question. I'm glad you brought up that question because in many ways it raises, there's a Kim Zetter article in Wired.com which talks about this attack as a signal, right? But if you read through the articles, there's at least 3 different signals going on. You can't have one attack carry 3 different signals because it's just not the bandwidth in any one particular attack to do that. Yes, it's just not clear what's going on. You know, on the one hand, Ukraine's cyber defensive capabilities aren't sophisticated by Western standards. Fortunately, however, their electricity management systems are also not sophisticated, so they could go back to manual mode in a few hours. There's a lot of talk that the hackers could have done more, but somehow restrained themselves. I see that all the time. At one point, I'll see somebody not restrain themselves, right? So it's hard to know what to make of it. As you point out, blowing up a pylon really, really is a lot harder to work your way out of than fiddling with certain controls. So in the end, 225,000 people lost power for 6 hours. In Pepco's heyday, they used to be able to do that without even blinking. I have to say, if anybody from Pepco, they're a little better now. They're at least in my neighborhood. Okay, so I don't want to razz on them totally. But you know, I mean, that's it, guys? That's what you have? So you still have a question mark why they do it. And if I had to give the least absurd answer, it's they were just messing around seeing what they could do. No, I mean, seriously. If I'm gonna test a bomb, right? I drop it somewhere and I look at it. And if I drop it here, there, or anywhere else, it's gonna look pretty much the same. I can test it at home. To test a cyber attack, you have to test it against somebody else's system, right? And this is sort of, could be a series of what I would call operational test and evaluation attacks. Let's see what this can do. I might want to use it later. Because in fact, Russia has shown a certain inordinate interest in playing around with other people's electric grids. Unfortunate.
Yeah, and that brings up an idea in my mind and something that I've thought about. Is Russia now the only cyber superpower who has used cyber weapons in a conflict? And do they now have preeminence and precedence in that space?
Well, I mean, yeah.
Was that during a conflict?
It depends who you read on this thing.
Yeah.
Right?
So, Ken, you've been very quiet. What do you think?
Well, I actually think Martin just described the Christmas attack really well. In that there's as with most things cybers, there is more questions than answers, and so much work that needs to be done. But I do think though that you know, we have to take these things seriously. It's important as thinkers in the national security space that we discuss these things and try and figure them out before something worse happens. Yeah, you know, it's hard to say. There's probably a lot of testing going on, maybe some signaling, but again, it's hard to know what the signal is, maybe unless you're on the inside. Actually, in 2009, Martin wrote a paper for our conference in Estonia called Sabrosa, Cyber Warfare, remember? And I've always talked about that ever since, and that one of the points he brought up was that unless you're on the inside, perhaps, you know, there's sort of this secret agency X and Y, and they're signaling to each other, and only they perhaps have the forensics and those knowledgeable about both attack and defense, and everybody else is kind of in the dark. And that's absolutely true if you think about it, unless they want to call in the media or something. And so there could be some aspects of this attack that we'll never know. But that's why I think that so many people are interested. I don't think as a cyber analyst I've ever gotten so many emails as around January when these articles were coming out, because I was in Ukraine and everybody wanted to know, do you know anything more about what's happening? But the only thing I can say on that is that the cyber guys that I know in Kiev, they say that initially, as most technical people are, they were very skeptical of the attack. But over time, they believe that there's actually something to the story, and that an attack did take place, that it's worth figuring out what happened.
So one of the things in Martin, and talking with you actually, that I wanted to kind of tease out here as well is you had mentioned that Russia's national narrative is such that maybe cyber is not necessarily one of the things that they're going to lean on as hard as some of the other uses of power that they have. And so I think I want to throw, we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left before we're going to open the floor to questions. Maybe just each of the panelists go through and talk about your thoughts about cyber in Russia's national narrative. And Martin, we'll start with you.
Well, I've heard it said, I don't know if this is true or not, that Putin never uses the word cyber, right? The Russians have a notion of information warfare that has psychological operations, EW, and cyber. And cyber is really the last dog because they love their psychological operations, that they think that the West does it to them all the time. They think they're hitting back. They think they're effective. On EW, they just kind of take these big honking jammers and turn them on to 11, and that's kind of their notion of electronic warfare, and it does a lot of, it works. Cyber is a lot more subtle, okay? I think the Russians doubtlessly have great capability, but I think they're still fiddle-farting around with what they're going to do with it. I mean, look, a lot of people do, right? This is this brand new shiny object, and I tell people, you look at the United States from the inside, and it looks like we're so confused, right? Then think about other people. They're even more confused than we are, because at least we have a basis of experience and expertise to make some halfway reasonable statements about what it can do. When you get past the United States, it starts getting really foggy and mythic.
Ken?
I take a pass for now.
Just to go back to this idea of, I think Russia has developed a tool of unconventional warfare, hybrid warfare, whatever you want to call it. The Russians themselves actually call it nonlinear warfare. And Russian officials have talked about this concept for quite some time and very openly. And I'll just go back to this point that I think it has much more to do with the information space, where cyber being just a subcomponent of that. But this whole idea that Russia has developed and tested in Ukraine, I think to go back to what Jeff was saying earlier, Ukraine is interesting from that perspective because it could teach us a lot about how Russia will probably approach other potential conflicts in its near abroad. And it is a lot of it about laying the theater in the information space to these non-linear warfare methods. That includes the information war, psychological component. It also includes influence to the export of corruption networks through funding certain political oppositional parties, which Russia has been doing extensively in Western and Eastern Europe. And Russia has unleashed some of the very same tools that's used in its own population within Russia that it then exported to Ukraine and has been exporting to Western and Eastern Europe as well. So I think this idea of cyber being just one element of a broader strategy is what we have to remember here.
I would just add, I like your comment, Martin, about the foggy and mythic aspect of all of this. I think that's right, and I think Russia benefits from it being foggy and mythic, and I think tries to ensure that it remains foggy and mythic. And so there's a certain sense in which the Russians have an incentive to play up their capabilities in cyber as well as in other domains, and partially for our own bureaucratic reasons in different places around this town, I think we have an incentive to play up those capabilities as well. So, I don't know. I'm not an engineer or a cyber person. I don't know how extensive those capabilities really are, but just looking at the politics of it, I think both the Russians and to some extent we benefit from maximizing our perception, or playing up the perception of what those capabilities actually are.
And Ken, we'll turn to you for the last word on the question.
I'll tell a short Russian anecdote. The Russians love anecdotes. And so I was at a high-level cybersecurity conference in Moscow State University a few years ago. And so there was a group of us that were from outside Russia, and somebody asked for the agenda, right? Because we have agenda for the conference. And so one of the Russian officials then went and got it and brought it back on a USB stick, right? And handed it to our group. And so the Israeli official who was sitting next to me, he sort of held up the USB stick and he gave a little countdown. And he said, you had witnessed this group the most recent Russian cyber attack, 321, and he put it in his computer. So, but along those lines, I thought of this because something Alina said, the psychological factor, right? I mean, who knows? I don't think there's anything on the USB stick, but you don't know. But there's a huge psychological element there. And are you going to take this while you're in Moscow and put it into your computer?
All right. Well, thank you. Now we'll open up to the floor for questions, and if you'll just wait for the microphone before you ask your question, it'd be good also if you state your name and affiliation if you prefer. We'll go first to you.
I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council. I have a rather lengthy question for Martin. Martin, good to see you. The question is, how much have things really changed? As you know, among the military, senior military, there's, I think, an artificial distinction between the character and nature of war. One is immutable and the other isn't. But, you know, suppose you had little green men crossing the border from Russia. They decided they want to form a coup in some small country and take over command and control. What I'm describing is Estonia in 1924, as you know, and the telephone central lines of what they were trying to do. And of course, they were repulsed. If you take a look at World War I, you had cyber galore. The underwater telegraph lines were vulnerable either to interruption or to pass false information. In terms of propaganda, you had the rape and torture of Belgian nuns and the Zimmermann telegram. Camouflage, the visual spectrum, was really a German specialty. They could mask field armies. And so you have all this going on, obviously without the depth that would occur today because you have so many more potential participants. But in terms of the warp and weave of cyber, given it has more dimensions today, what do you think really has changed in terms of the character and nature of it?
We finish at 8, right? The technology keeps changing, but stuff that I wrote 20 years ago, some of it's right and some of it's still wrong, okay? It changes faster than a lot of other forms of warfare. But you know, history is still worth reading. Let me actually give you a quasi-answer because it touches on something that, well, I'll just say. Back in the mid-90s, there was something called information warfare. And it was sort of organized by, we want to touch the information that the other side has. And there are a lot of ways of doing it. There's electronic warfare, psychological operations, ISR, there's cyber warfare, there's even taking your old rifle and trying to pick off the general on the other side. A lot of these things have antecedents. Cyber war in and of itself doesn't really have a large number of antecedents, but you could see antecedents for the other things. DoD spent most of the 90s breaking its pick intellectually on trying to make a unified theory of information warfare, and they couldn't do it. And they couldn't do it because even though the goals of these various forms of warfare were similar, the means by which these forms of warfare were carried out were very, very different, okay? So you put the guys who stare at CNN television screens and the guys who stare at computer screens, and you think they're both staring at screens, so therefore they must have a lot to say to each other, and they don't, okay? Fast forward to today. What we're starting to see is that with the profusion of electronics in societies, there are emerging methods of information warfare that in fact look a lot like cyber war. If I want to collect information on you, right, I can have 20 million people fill out forms. Or I can go to OPM and steal 20 million forms outright. And I'll have a vast treasure trove of ISR. You can do the same with cell phones, with surveillance cameras, with all sorts of things. For the electronic warfare, right, I can try to generate RF frequency, or I can try to take advantage of all the RF frequency that other people are going to generate. If you talk psychological warfare, there's social media, and there's a lot of cyber ways of playing with social media. And then you have certain factors that you didn't have 20 years ago, which is the Internet of Things. Because they're starting to get connected together in ways that just didn't happen 20 years ago. And I think there's an emerging form of information warfare that takes place not at the battlefield layer, but at the layer of society that can incorporate these things together. So in many ways, we're marching forward to the past, or as it's colloquially said, back to the future. In other words, we may be back to a theory of information warfare that can unify this stuff, but it's not going to have all the elements that we traditionally think of information warfare, right? You can think of a JWACS as part of information warfare. You can think of a huge jammer as part of information warfare. And that's going to be traditional, and that's going to stay around, and that's going to do military useful things, but it's not going to be part of the new information warfare. And that's incoherent because I haven't written it down yet, but it gives a sense, and you asked the question anyhow.
So let me try and answer it in a slightly different way. And maybe it's a summary of what you're saying, so maybe you can write this one down. But I was just watching a presentation that Sean Canuck, the National Intelligence Officer for Cyber, did at Berkman Center. And he was making the point that cyber is not a distinct theater of warfare. If it doesn't impact something kinetic, bits and bytes meeting blood and bone, kind of it doesn't matter, right? And I think the conclusion that I would draw from that, as well as our discussion today, is that maybe the aims of warfare haven't changed. And so the closer you get to the aims, the more it looks like traditional warfare. The more you look at the details of the methods of how they do it and what they do, the more new it looks. And I think that makes an assumption, which I'll state here so that somebody else can investigate it, but are there new aims to warfare because of the hyperconnectivity and the complete dependence and reliance upon connected technology that we've established in our societies? I think that might be an open question. Anybody else want to take a stab? No? Okay. Who's next? Yes, I saw your hand first.
I have a quick question, Martin, for what you were saying. I think you are articulating why we haven't seen a full-on cyber war at this point between the U.S. and, the Russians and the Ukrainians, is because of 2 points: feasibility, right? Is it even possible? And the second point is escalation. Do we want to take it to a certain level? What about I would posit this other third possibility of revealing capabilities, and in particular in the Russians' case, not wanting to show what they can do, because the forensics of that from the U.S. perspective would be a fantastic treasure trove of information that they could get for themselves.
That's always a risk when you carry out cyber war. But at some point you had to ask, who are you saving this stuff for, right? The bigger enemy, right? Even bigger than that. It's possible. It's possible. You don't necessarily have to show your best stuff to have an effect. In fact, usually the way the professionals do it is they don't necessarily show their best stuff unless they're going after a really, really hard target. If you just want to make noise, you go after a weak target and you exploit the weaknesses that all large networks tend to have.
Yep. Yes.
Hi, my name is Patrick Maldry. I'm from Estonia, and I'm heading up the new SIPA Cyber Defense Initiative here in DC. So thank you to our friends at the Atlantic Council for bringing attention to this book. Kudos to Ken and company for putting this out there. I've had the pleasure to read the whole thing. I'm wondering what, if the panel has any thoughts on what are the political and strategic implications of this case study. What exactly can we change about our country's cyber policies? What can NATO, in particular, learn? And how can we use this to go forward? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a technical question.
Sure. I'll take the last chapter in the book, Richard Baitlick, for example. And so his point is well taken. I think that there's a lot to be done in terms of investment in education and focus and understanding. And perhaps cyber warfare is overestimated, or perhaps we haven't seen what's in the classified arsenal. But again, there's a lot to be done in terms of education and awareness, I think. And that's essentially what I was hoping to do with the book as well, is ask 20 different authors and say, okay, what do you think about in the evolution of warfare and the evolution of international relations and conflict, the use of IT and the abuse of IT, So some of it is just softer these days, perhaps, than maybe we would have expected. I have students at the university in Kiev, and when I ask them, do you see reflections of the conflict and examples of propaganda within your social media space, immediately all the hands go up, right? So that's interesting. You can also, you can conduct espionage, and you can also push information, and you can push it very specifically. So the technical chapters from the Ukrainian experts, they talk about some technical details, like at Maidan, for example, when on particular streets now you would send warnings. The government under Yanukovych would send warnings to particular protesters only on a particular street. You're getting too close to the presidential palace. You move any farther and you'll be arrested. Right, so you can be very, very highly targeted with this stuff, and commercial firms, marketing firms, they're the real experts on this, and governments are probably way behind where the marketeers are. But basically, you can fingerprint people pretty well in cyberspace, I think, based on their browsing activity, basically their network traffic, high-level analysis, who they are and who they're going to vote for and what they eat and where they're going tomorrow. You really can. And that information in the hands of a government is really powerful. You have Wikipedia on the one hand, but then you have George Orwell on the other hand. Which is the United States, did we create this thing for the benefit of the world, or did we create it so that autocrats and dictators could basically smother their own space with surveillance and political control?
Just to pick up on this idea of digital fingerprints, I think that's a really nice terminology, because just as there are vulnerabilities in our own system that countries like Russia or China can exploit, we can also use people's propensity to want to share information about themselves in the online space to our advantage as well. And outside the government space, without having access to the classified sector, there are a lot of groups that have been doing this kind of work already. Journalists, investigative journalist groups that look at, how they're able to track an individual's movement based on their own posts and their social media profiles, for example. I'm thinking of a particular example, which is this group called Bellingcat in England that does this extremely well. We work with Bellingcat very closely at the Atlantic Council, and we did a report on this that we put out almost a year ago at this point that actually looked and proved that there were Russian soldiers serving in Ukraine at the time when the Russian government was denying this outright. And the way we did this is exactly by following the digital breadcrumbs or the fingerprints that these individuals leave behind. And from that, you can do a lot with that. And I think at this point, it would be smart from a policy perspective for organizations that are interested in how do we harness this metadata that we have at our fingertips. It's all public information in a more in a smarter way. So I think funding these kinds of civil society investigative journalist groups like Bellingcat and others, there are plenty of these in Ukraine actually as well. They've been doing amazing work. I think that would be a smart thing to do. So actually empowering the individuals that have the skills but are working outside of government to be able to do this kind of work.
Yes.
Hi, Brian Kriegel from Northrop Grumman. Kenneth, good to see you here, and I appreciate all the insights of the panel. I have a kind of a general question, I guess, for the panel as a whole. One thing I didn't hear discussed was issues of command and control over cyber operations, and particularly offensive operations. And I was just wondering if, in your research or your readings and observations of the recent conflict, if you've seen any indications of Russian concern over their ability to maintain positive control over offensive cyber operations, whether it's maintaining tools within their targeted environments or their intended targets, keeping them from jumping the fence a la Stuxnet, or the ability to maintain mass groups like patriotic hackers so that they continue to operate in alignment with military or operational or strategic objectives.
I think Martin may be the best voice on this, but one of the things about Putin and Russia today, I think they're so aggressive. I'm not sure they're so worried about this. Flying 30 feet over our ship in the Baltic, and this is I think that Putin wants conflict and wants an enemy. So I'm not. But your point is well taken. Is there a sense in which they're worried about losing sort of valuable source code? I don't think so. I don't think we've seen those kind of attacks.
Yours is sort of I sense a two-level question. One, how can leadership in fact keep control over the hackers? And the other one, more technical, how can hackers actually keep control over the code? Let me sort of just address the first one. My sense is that Russia has 3 different hacker communities. One of them is the criminal community, one of them is the intelligence community, and one of them, which is the weakest of the 3, is the military community, which is, I think, one of the reasons that we might not have seen as much cyber in the conflict space is because of the difficulties of getting the quality people and integrating them in with the military. The integration of kinetic effects and cyber effects is very, very difficult. And I think the United States is ahead, but that's not saying very much because it's because of the difficulty of the challenge of actually trying to make them work with one another. One of Russia's disadvantages, I believe, is that it's more prestige working for the intelligence community and more lucrative working for the criminal community. The army neither has money nor prestige. And they don't treat people very well in the army. So I think for all its talent in Russia, my hunch is that they will be disproportionately far behind in trying to integrate kinetic and cyber. Which probably didn't answer your question, but I thought I'd go on anyway.
So one of the things that I have a question about too is the thing you brought up. How do you, if you're going to essentially deputize cyber criminals or patriotic national hackers, how do you keep control of them? How do you keep it from becoming a 21st century privateer situation where you've got essentially state-sanctioned pirates going and capturing the ships of other people like we saw in the 1700s? And one of the things that I think nation states probably are very concerned about is how do we keep these people from trampling our other operations that are going on? And I think that that's an open question. I don't know anybody who's openly admitting to using, well, I take that back. I was just recently at our Cyber 912 competition in Europe, and some of the Polish teams, yes, his team did great. Some of the Polish teams were talking about their use, the government's use of kind of sanctioning nationalistic hackers to go and do things. Now, what that means, I don't quite know. How you rein that in, how you put a boundary on it, I don't know. But it seems like something that's going to become more prevalent, whether it's open or closed. So I think it's a good question to be asking. Yes.
Sergeant Edon from the Marine Corps Information Operations Center. And I think the Marine Corps believes that we have cracked the code on how to integrate, synchronize, and coordinate all these IRCs to support the command and commander. I'd like to put forward 3 ideas, alternatives to why we haven't seen the sort of cyber warfare attacks in Russia. First one's psychological, second one's operational, and the third one's from a capabilities perspective. When we're looking at the Russian mentality, we're thinking about individuals that are steeped in Maskarova. You know, Putin, he's from that KGB era that was incredibly proficient in these active measures. And when you look at the last 100 years of Soviet activities in the intelligence sphere, 1991 to 2001 are really the outliers when it comes to what they were doing in the psychological warfare space. So these guys are thinking incredibly deep about how to do these deception operations at levels that we cannot comprehend as a Western culture because we have this open society. You think about World War II, the sacrifice of 77,000 troops in Operation Mars could either be considered General Zhukov's greatest failure or one of his greatest deception operations because it allowed Operation Uranus to absolutely decimate the Germans afterwards. So from a psychological perspective, they're much more conditioned to be able to do deception operations. Second, from an operational perspective, this is active measures again. That's what it is. So they are more so concerned about the psychological impacts of what they're doing than they are about the physical impacts. And this allows them to do the salami slicing, which was such an ever prevalent thing during the Cold War period, which allowed them to get their political objectives without the risk of escalation. And the third is from a capabilities perspective. I think a lot of the activities that we're seeing the Russians doing are what we in the U.S. would categorize as cyber operational preparation of the environment. When you look at psychological operations, you're not really going to have an intelligence gain off of that. Electronic warfare, you're not going to have an electronic intelligence gain off of that. But with cyber activities, there's an incredible amount of intelligence gain that you can gather from that. Speaking to the example of the RT posters that were in the subway, the real genius of that wasn't necessarily, hey, we're increasing our audience for people that are going to RT. I mean, one of the most important things about it was it said, go to RT.com. And we go to RT.com, and you can do this on your own private computer, which I don't recommend. You look in your temporary internet files and look at the cookies that are downloaded onto your computer. And that is what they want. That is what they want on their computers, the botnets, to allow them to do those sorts of control things. So I think that is why we're not seeing this stuff, because it has more of a payoff on that cyber operational preparation environment side.
Yeah. I think that's a fairly good framework. I mean, as good as any that's posited, right, until you know what it actually is. But I definitely see the heavy use of psychological information, whether you call it warfare or just propaganda, is really heavy out there. You look at the troll factories and other similar type things. I'm reminded of a quote from, I think it was the Hunt for Red October, which is, I'll paraphrase here, but Russian doesn't go to the bathroom without having a plan, right? And you're right that they are very planful, very clueful, and they think long-term strategically in a lot of the things that they do and carry out. So you may be right on with that.
Hello, Patton Adams, VeriSign iDefense. I'm curious if the Christmas attacks were a test, just possibility. What other tests have we also observed that we may not have called a test or considered a test? And what indications are there of lessons learned from this test, or how the Russian side would be incorporating the lessons they're learning? And overlapping a little bit with some other comments, how, if nonlinear warfare involves information warfare, information control, and the commercial sector is showing the greatest degree of innovation in that space, is it possible to learn a lesson that fast from such a test before the landscape changes?
I think that's a good question. I think, you know, if you're looking to test something, maybe it's response of the international community to this type of thing. And one of the things that that Russia seems to be very, very good at is starting slow and then gradually escalating to where there's no step where you can say, you know, this step from the previous one, now it's clear, there's a line that's been crossed. But they just gradually ease on past those lines that if you ask from, you know, very beginning of campaign to end of campaign, if you go from here to here, will it cross a line? Yes. But now you say, okay, where did we cross that line? And it's much more gray, and there's much more ambiguity there. So I think if there is a test, and it could very well be, I think that's a good hypothesis, that that's one of the tests that they may be looking for. And I don't think that will change very quickly. I think that will remain constant, only in an escalatory mode.
Everything is a test. I mean, if you're not learning from this stuff, right, what are you doing it for? Let's see, what are that? The Black Energy attack, the Dragonfly/Havocus attacks may have been a lot of tests. Russia pulled off 2 false flag attacks pretending to be ISIS, one against the Warsaw Stock Exchange, one against the French TV5. The NASDAQ hack of 5 years ago is very curious because it used 2 0 days, which is a lot to burn on that, and we don't really know what they were doing. So they're learning from this stuff. They're learning from this stuff. I think what they're interested in learning are the things that are not, you know, is port 23 the most favorite port, and should I use that? But how do people react to things? And in many ways, if you think about it, if you know that somebody's pulling off a test on you, There are ways you can react to get the results to make it look like you want to do. And even if you don't, you may be lucky, right? If the Russians learn that the Ukrainians can restore power for 5 hours, they may basically say, I'm not quite too sure this weapon is going to do what we want it to do, right? Not that a bunch of very clever Ukrainian engineers said, if we restore this fast, the Russians will do this again, right?
Yeah. We got time for one more question before we kind of wrap up today. Yes, over there.
Hi, I'm Bernard Kapinski from CBO. This morning at the hearings on the Hill, I believe it was Mr. Cawley testified that a cyber attack on the U.S. electric grid would not cause a long-term outage. Based on what you saw in Ukraine, how would you agree with that statement or disagree?
Well, I mean, Ukraine was a short-term outage, okay? You have to take a look at we're a little more dependent on this stuff than Ukraine is. Let me give you generalizations. There are two things that give you troubles. One is the cascading failure, of which we see in the United States in 2003 and then in the Southwest of the United States in 2009, right? We're trying to engineer these out of the system. We think we have, and I'm not sure we have yet, okay? It's just one of those surprises. The other thing is if you can actually break something with a cyber attack, and that's actually fairly hard to do because a large part of the electric utility sector doesn't have moving parts. And if it doesn't have moving parts, moving parts break things. Not moving parts, you have a little harder challenge ahead. My sense is that he's right, okay? But I'm not necessarily willing to go like this to the problem. I think we need to look at it a little harder.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly complex and complicated interconnected system. There's not one grid to begin with in the U.S. There's multiple grids, and I think it's like 4 or 5. I don't remember the exact number. But each of them operates quasi-independently. And as you mentioned, we've seen some of the grids go out that there may have been some cyber component to that. Relays couldn't switch over quickly enough. So I think that the cascading failures issue is one that isn't solved, right? It's just perpetuated more by more dependence and interdependence and connectivity. I would also wonder whether you could pull off a cyber attack at the same time as a kinetic attack, the same type that we saw with the shooting out of some of the substation equipment in Southern California that was reported on a few years ago, and whether that combination might be something that does take the grid down for quite a while. You have load passing from one substation to another. You have the physical thing destroyed, and therefore it has some type of a cascading failure that might, I don't know, I'm not an electrical engineer, but it might take out or have other physical effects that cause things to break. So I don't think you can say yes or no. I mean, obviously it depends on the scale of the attack. One ping sweep is not going to take down the grid, right? Depending on where you do the ping sweep, I guess. But then again, if there is a combined cyber physical attack, I would think it could definitely take down the grid, at least for some period of weeks until you're able to replace some of the transformers that are broken. But again, that's more the physical piece of it than it is the cyber piece. Any other answers on the panel?
I'm not an electrical engineer either.
Okay, so at that, it's probably about time to wrap up. I will pose one last question to the panel, and we'll start in reverse order. So in the next 12 months, what do you see as an escalation of cyber crisis situation in Ukraine? Jeff?
Well, it's going to depend on the politics. Right now, there's a ceasefire in place, the Minsk agreement. In general, everybody kind of has an interest in pretending that the ceasefire is holding because the alternatives are bad on either side. But you're seeing a lot of stress on the system. One of the components of it is the sanctions regime that the Europeans are imposing on Russia over their involvement in Ukraine. Those are up for renewal this summer, and then again 6 months after that. There's more and more dissent among the European governments about the prolongation of sanctions. My guess is they'll probably be prolonged this summer, but 6 months after that, it's harder to say. And once those go away, it's going to be tough to get them back. And so if let's say they go away and the leadership in Moscow decides that the political objectives, acceptable political conditions in Ukraine haven't been achieved, that's when you start worrying about the Minsk ceasefire breaking down. And at that point, potentially you see a return to some of the things that we saw in 2014, 2015, including on the cyber side. Elena?
I completely agree with Jeff about the situation will very much depend on not just the politics in terms of the geopolitics, the relationship between the EU, Ukraine, Russia, and the U.S., but also Ukraine's internal politics. For those of you that are following what's happening in Ukraine right now, I think we're all very much aware of the current political crisis that's still ongoing. There's a new government in place as of today, but what has happened in the last few months is that the Ukrainian government has put itself in a very vulnerable position because it has been so difficult to get consensus to renew Ukraine's commitment to the European and international packages that it has to put forth, that it has to pursue reforms in accordance with those IMF packages. And so I think right now Ukraine is in a critical moment, and it's in a very vulnerable place. And I would not be surprised to see, Jeff was talking about more of, I think, a medium or long-term view. I would not be surprised to see Russia being able to take advantage of these particular vulnerabilities in more of in the short term.
Ken?
More Panama Papers.
Martin?
More turkey?
More turkey. All right, well, I'll venture a guess that the upcoming NATO summit in Warsaw might trigger a reopening of something that would cause Moscow to want to have a sideshow or a distraction, and also have maybe not a seat at the table in Warsaw, but at least mind share there to distract people from the thing that they're trying to do. So that would be my prediction. So with that, thank you all very much for coming out. Thank you for tuning in on the webcast. And I'd like also to thank CSM Passcode, our media partner. And we'll invite you back next month for another exciting edition of Cyber Risk Wednesday. Thank you.